One of the critical moments came when the cathedral was facing financial problems, and the answer was to replace the 19th century structure with a high-rise tower. Yeah. There was a design developed by Arthur Erickson. It was approved by Archbishop David and by you and the church committee, and yet there was enormous resistance to it, largely from non-cathedral sources. And we know how that ended. What do you think the difference would have been to the city if that plan had gone ahead?
Well, I'll give you an answer you may not expect. Let's stay with the design for the new church, underneath, etc. I remember about 10 years ago kind of having a moment of revelation about that. And I don't know what made me think of it. My goodness, it's far more long gone than that. Do you realize that that design of Arthur's, that because he designed it as a tiered university lecture room, and at the bottom, at the Burrard corner, but 30 or 40 feet down, at the Burrard, Georgia corner, under a tower which would let the light down on the altar. And the altar would be down there. I would be sitting here. Suppose I'm worshiping, suppose it had come true. And you and I are worshiping here. And down there is somebody celebrating, etc. I realized that because all of us who were envisaging that plan were in our 40s, that we never realized that it would be absolutely impossible for a person, say, in their, first of all, it would have been almost impossible for a person with any physical disability to negotiate that design. And it would be extremely challenging for anybody, say, not even my age, but say 70s up, to negotiate that design. If it had been made like that, we would have, I think we would have had a disaster on our hands. But because none of us were at that stage, we said, this is cool, this is wonderful. Now, I sometimes wonder whether, you remember Tudor Omni? Wonderful man, treasurer, uncannily like George V. I remember an old friend, John Waters, who said to me one day, he said, where else can you come for communion at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning and listen to George V read the lesson? Anyway, but Tudor, who was controller of Caminco for many years and had a very good financial head, he said to me one day, years after, he said, you know, I don't think the numbers, the money numbers would have stood up, considering what was going to happen to the value of money by now. So it didn't happen, and maybe that was providential, because what do we now have? We really have the best of both worlds. We have the tradition, we have the traditional cathedral, but we have it just ablaze with life. You know, thanks to a lot of people, but in terms of leadership, thanks to Peter Elliott.
One of the great wrenches for the cathedral congregation was your appointment to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And many people, of course, had hoped that you would be at the cathedral forever. And it seemed at the time for you a wonderful appointment, but it really didn't work out. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, it didn't work out because right from the word go, it was a non-starter. I always remember when they started looking for somebody, they said, we want 4 things. We want preacher, teacher of preaching. We want an administrator and a fundraiser. Now, apart from anything else, these are kind of left-right brain opposites. And I said when they came to me, because I had done a couple of things the year before with the American House of Bishops, and that was how it began to be put together. And I said, look, I think I can respond to what you want, the first 2, preacher, teacher, but I am not administrator, fundraiser. And they said, don't worry, we'll buy one. Well, gee, that's nice. 6 weeks after I went, there was a meeting of the council of the college. And they said, guess what? The books do not look good. We can't afford to buy one of those. So guess what? Guess who is to be preacher, teacher, administrator, fundraiser? And I knew it wasn't going to work. And we lurched along for half an academic year. And when I was back in Canada one week, I asked Ted to chat. And I said, Ted, this is not working. And I told him why. So I stayed 2 years because it looks better on your resume, you know. And then Ted said, look, let's see how we can get you back. And I came back as the rector of Christ Church in Calgary, and we had 9 wonderful years. But about 6 months after I left the college, I got a phone call from the college from my successor, who himself was a fundraiser administrator. And he was not a teacher and preacher. I knew it. He wasn't pretending to be. But he said, look, would you consider coming back and doing 3 conferences, week-long conferences each year, and see how it goes? And I did that for 27 years. So it kind of worked out.
It did.
It was difficult at the time. It was the first time in my life that something hadn't worked. And that's not a good feeling. But it was also big learning curve. How something that something that you really first saw as a total negative in your life, like crash. And it begins to open all sorts of doors, and became that role of doing what I really liked to do in the college and other parts of the American church. Just was immensely fulfilling. So, c'est la vie.
Yes. You've led workshops for preachers in several countries for different denominations. What are the key things you tell Tyro preachers?
The key thing was narrative is the most powerful way to communicate. Narrative and image, not necessarily concepts, explanations, analysis, etc. Teaching. Nothing wrong with teaching, but tell stories. Never forget that something like 97% of the library we call the Bible is stories. And also never forget that the big thing that Judaism, particularly Judaism, says to us. For instance, it's a well-known fact that there isn't that much religion. There isn't that much religion in the Bible. Jesus never said, "I have come that you might have more religion." He said, "I come that you might have more life." And so what the Bible is full of, the Bible says this: if you want to find out about God, then you explore the lives of these men and women. This long record of men and women, all of them extremely human. And see how, in the way that they loved and hated and cried and laughed and worked and died and made love and all, that's where God is. That's where the sacred is. The sacred is in those lives, and when you explore those lives, you begin to learn things about yourself, and you begin to allow people who listen to learn things about themselves, and do it like that. That's I pushed that. I pushed that very hard.
You had a long run with a radio series called One Man's Journal. Is it true that you did about 1,000 items for that?
I did roughly 3,700. Like, it went on for about 15 years. Yes. And actually, it went on a bit longer, because when I went to Washington, the station hired some studio time in Washington, and so I did them and sent the tapes back. And then I went to Calgary, and they hired some studio time there, so I did it for a couple of years in Calgary. I did at least 3,500.
I remember there was an occasion when you were at Sorrento, and you slipped on the dock and broke an arm, and you said to me, while I was lying there, I thought, I can get 3 items out of this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, after a while, you just, they just came. I got used to thinking in 2.5-minute cycles. And the old thing that you know better than I do about radio, it puts you in touch so richly with people. I remember Archbishop Carney. Remember Archbishop Carney? Joe Carney, or was that his brother? Anyway, we were at, I didn't know that. We were at something, some ecumenical thing. And he said to me, that program of yours, he said, it's an extraordinary thing. He said, it's not religious, and yet it's a kind of a, and he was quite mystified. He said, I think it must be a kind of a pre-evangelism. And that's what it was. Yes. Mind you, I had kind of a golden rule for myself in that, to say, by the law of averages, anytime I do this, there are people really going through the mill. So whatever I do with these pieces, I try to encourage, try to give hope, try to give a moment of levity even, try to give a moment of joy, try to give a moment of beauty. Almost really kind of responding to where St. Paul in one of the epistles says, forgotten which letter it is, and it doesn't matter, but he says, whatsoever things are good, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things. And I realized that that's what I was doing, and maybe that's why it worked. Yeah.
You've done an enormous amount of writing. I think of the 9 volumes of reflections on readings from the lectionary. How do you manage your writing time? How do you organize it?
Well, there was a time that I kind of wrote, well, it was a time when I was younger that I could write. I can remember in Calgary coming home after a vestry meeting, or, after a committee meeting, and making a cup of tea or something, and beginning to write at 10:30 and going on till 1:30 in the morning. And I mean, gradually the ability to do that left. But I still write a fair bit. Now I kind of, I remember John Updike saying, get up, go somewhere, go to the fridge. He did that a lot, so after a while he began to show it. But anyway, so now I have to break it because, you get stiff when you're older. But the writing, I find writing is an uncanny thing. You don't say, I must write X. I find for me that X comes and says, sort of crawls up my back and says, write me. You sit down and write me, because I want to be written. And that still works. That still works for me. Oh, that 9 books about the lectionary? Yes. Which actually a lot of clergy use those. I was really grateful that all that slog was worthwhile. But no sooner were they out, but the Canadian Church moved off one lectionary onto another. And I sat down and I wrote the 9 books differently. I mean, I could no more do it now. Well, who knows? If I had to, maybe I could. But writing for me is the most relaxing thing I can do. It's joy. I think of a lovely thing of Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore was an early Khalil Gibran, the prophet. He was a generation earlier. Indian. And he has a lovely thing where he says, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and found that life is duty. I acted and found that duty is joy.
Splendid, splendid. You've conducted workshops on George Herbert and T.S. Eliot, and you often quote Yeats, and you've just quoted Tagore. Are these your favorite writers, your favorite poets?
Well, it was impossible to grow up in Ireland and not, when you are old and grey and full of sleep, and etc. And one of the great heroes of Irish history is, one of the great guys in Irish history was W.B. Yeats. For reasons, a bundle of reasons. He wrote this, probably some of the loveliest love poetry that's ever been written in English. And he was the first Nobel Prize winner in Irish history. And he got involved through a love affair with the revolution in the 1920s. He was always a bit of a dilettante revolutionary. But you couldn't help but know him as an Irish schoolboy. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. Which reminds me of another beautiful moment of poetry that I'll get back to. For me, a lifelong love of poetry. Because, and what I'm glad to see at this stage in my life, is a return of poetry as no longer the Cinderella of the humanities in Western life. It's coming back. And so many in today's, I love the poetry of Mary Oliver, American poet. Love the poetry of Billy Collins, and on and on. A moment of poetry, never forgot. Was in the cathedral summer, and a wonderful person was dying in the general. And I went in about 9 o'clock to see Len. It's long ago, so let's call him Len. That was his name. Wonderful, wonderful man. Really not, he wasn't a parishioner anymore, he was a friend. And I went into they had moved him into a private small ward because his life was drawing to a close. And he was in the bed, lying away from me as I went in. And I went very up close. And I said to him, or said for him, Psalm 84, that for me I think it's the loveliest of the 150 Psalms. Oh, how lovely are thy dwellings, O Lord of hosts, my Lord and my God. My soul hath a desire and longing to enter into the courts of my Lord. Yea, the sparrow has found her an house, and the swallow a nest where she may lay her young. Even thine altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Blessed is the man who, going through the vale of misery, use it for a well, and the pools are filled with water. He shall go from strength to strength. And Len started to say, when we got to, blessed is the man whose faith is in thee, just about halfway through what I was saying, Len began very, very faintly to say a verse of the psalm. And I realized that he had kind of come back to do that because he was very far out on his journey. And I remember I said goodnight, gave him a sort of kind of hug that you could give somebody even though they were lying there. And I came away and I was walking down the corridor. And just as I came near a door, a nurse brought an elderly woman in a wheelchair out, and they turned and they walked on ahead of me. But it was the pose of the woman that struck me for a moment as I saw her side on. She was deathly pale, hair was lank. She was so frail that she had to be held in by a strap, and her hands were lank. And suddenly, in that sunlit corridor, a strong voice that wasn't the nurse's said, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vale and hill, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. And it was she. Voice. And something in all the years after I've pushed at people, have a golden treasury in your own head for when you need it, so that you can voyage within. And what is it? I think it's either Keats or Shelley speaks of casements open on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn, so that you can open those casements inside yourself. And I've always pushed that in sermon seminars. Develop an anthology. If you see something beautiful, get it down. Treasure it. Make it and if possible, memorize it.